Well, good morning to everyone here in Fredericton. Um, Today, I'm just going to do an overview of the private sponsorship of refugee program in Canada. By the way, if there are any questions, I will be happy to answer questions at the end of the presentation. If some come up in the chat during the presentation, maybe if someone can just let me know, because I can't see the chat from where I am, and I'll be happy to answer your questions. So to begin, I just want to tell you a little bit about the Refugee Sponsorship Training Program, which is the program that I work in here in New Brunswick. So it's a free program, and it's for anyone who is sponsoring private refugees to Canada. It has funding from IRCC, that's in the federal government of Canada. We have trainers all across Canada in each of the different provinces. And we offer workshops and information sessions and answers to any questions about sponsorship. So this is what we're going to cover this morning. First, we'll look at what is private refugee sponsorship, and then who can be sponsored to come to Canada, who can sponsor refugees from within Canada, what are the sponsorship costs to sponsor a refugee to Canada, the settlement responsibilities for sponsors in Canada, and then I'll be able to take your questions if you have any questions at the end. So this slide shows just the latest statistics from the United Nations about displaced people around the world. So there are about 110 forcibly displaced people around the world. About 35 million are refugees. And refugees means people who have fled their home countries because of war or because of persecution, and they're now living in a different country.
Tim, would you please, they are asking to add a little pause after each sentence for the interpreters. Thank you.
Okay, I'll try to add more pause, yeah. So again, just a refugee is someone who has fled their country and is now living in a different country. There are 62 million internally displaced people. And about 5 million asylum seekers in Canada. And so this is what the private sponsorship of refugees is. It's the resettlement of a refugee to Canada with financial costs and settlement support provided by private groups for 12 months. So we know that the government sponsors people to come to Canada. And when the government sponsors refugees to Canada, the government covers all of their costs and also provides settlement support to them. With private sponsorship of refugees, it's Canadian citizens and permanent residents who provide the cost and the settlement support. So private sponsorship allows Canadian citizens and permanent residents to engage in the resettlement of refugees from abroad. And one of the things that makes private sponsorship more appealing is that sponsors are able to name the refugees that they want to sponsor. And that makes it possible for families to bring their relatives or friends from abroad. So the way that private sponsorship works is that the sponsors give financial support to the refugees to cover their expenses for the sponsorship period. And usually that's about 12 months after the refugees arrive in Canada. And sponsors also provide refugees with settlement support when they arrive in Canada for the 12 months as well. And settlement support could mean helping the newcomers to find houses, or opening a bank account, or enrolling in school, and things like that. So these are the different ways that refugees are sponsored to come to Canada. You can see the first three ways, which are government sponsorship, joint sponsorship, and blended sponsorship. And in these three ways, the finances, the money for the sponsorship, comes either from the government or from a combination of the government and Canadian citizens. And at the bottom, you'll see that in the first three ways, the refugees are referred to Canada by the United Nations. Now, in private sponsorship, you will see that the finances and the money provided for the sponsorship is provided by individual Canadian citizens and permanent residents. And the refugees who come to Canada under private sponsorship are referred by Canadian citizens and permanent residents as well. So let's look at who can privately sponsor refugees in Canada. There are 3 groups who can privately sponsor refugees. The first group are called sponsorship agreement holders. The second group are called a group of 5. And the third group are called community sponsors. Sponsorship agreement holders are an organization that have an agreement with the government of Canada to sponsor refugees. A group of 5 is simply 5 Canadian citizens or permanent residents who come together to sponsor refugees. And community sponsors are any organization or association within Canada. Now, these are some of the differences between these types of groups. So sponsorship agreement holders can sponsor a limited number of refugees each year. And the refugees that they sponsor do not need to have refugee status. For groups of 5 and community sponsors, they can sponsor as many refugees as they want, as long as they have the financial capacity. But for groups of 5 and community sponsors, the refugees have to have refugee status in the countries where they live. So just to go over each of these groups again, a sponsorship agreement holder is an incorporated organization, and it has signed a formal sponsorship agreement with IRCC and the government. A community sponsor is any organization or association that's located in the community where the refugee is going to settle. Now, for groups of 5, as I said, the refugee must have a refugee status document in order to be sponsored. And a group of 5 is made up of at least 5 Canadian citizens or permanent residents. They have to be 18 years or older. They have to have the financial capacity to be able to sponsor and the settlement capacity to be able to settle the refugees when they arrive in Canada. And they also have to live in the same community where the refugees are going to spend their first year. So if you live in Fredericton, you can only sponsor a refugee in Fredericton. These are a few more important points about groups of fives and community sponsors. So you can only sponsor someone who is recognized as a refugee by the United Nations or by the government where they live. After a person has been recognized as a refugee, they receive a refugee status document, and that's a very important document. Sometimes refugees have other documents, like a UN asylum seeker certificate or UN registration or UNWRA document, but these are not the same as a refugee status document. So if you want to sponsor a refugee, it's important first to decide or to speak to them and find out if they have a refugee status document. So a little bit more about refugee status documents. Only one person in the family needs to have the refugee status document. Refugee status documents are mandatory for groups of five and community sponsors. If the refugee does not have a refugee status document, then they can only be sponsored by a sponsorship agreement holder organization. And normally, if a refugee has a refugee status document, it will have words that say that they are a recognized refugee. So if you have a document and you're not sure if it's a refugee status document, you should look for those words that it says that they are a recognized refugee. Again, if the refugee does not have a refugee status document, you can only sponsor them through an organization called a sponsorship agreement holder. And the way to find a sponsorship agreement holder is on the government's website. So you just type in sponsorship agreement holder and their website will come up. And then you click on your province. When you click on your province, New Brunswick, it will show you a list of all the sponsorship agreement holders in our province.
There is a question or ask to go back one slide, please.
Okay, about the refugee status documents?
I think yes.
This is the previous slide, and it just shows examples of what refugee status documents look like.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so again, in order to find a sponsorship agreement holder, you can look on the government's website and you just click on the list of provinces. Now let's look at who can be sponsored to come to Canada. And the answer is that only a refugee and their family can be sponsored to come to Canada. And there are two different types of refugees. The first is someone who has a fear of persecution based on their race, religion, nationality, their membership in a social group, or their political opinion. And the second are people who are seriously affected personally by war or who have suffered human rights violations. So in order to be a refugee, you would have to fit into one of those two categories. So if you want to sponsor someone who is a refugee, these are the rules that they will have to meet in order to be sponsored to Canada. The first rule is that they have left their home country. The second rule is that they have a sponsoring group in Canada who wants to sponsor them. The third is that they're unable to return to their home country. And also, they cannot stay in the current country where they live. And then finally, they cannot resettle in a different safe country. So in order to be sponsored as a refugee, the refugee has to meet each of these requirements. Now let's look at who can be included in an application for sponsoring a refugee to Canada. So there's always one member of the family who we refer to as the principal refugee applicant. And that principal applicant can be sponsored along with all of their family members. And that means their spouse or common law partner and all of their children who are under 22 years old. So when you want to sponsor someone, they have to be a refugee. And then they can be sponsored with their spouse and their children, all on the same application. Now let's look at what the financial cost of sponsorship is. Privately sponsoring refugees can be quite expensive. The costs that sponsors have to cover include the cost of food, rent, household utilities, and other day-to-day living expenses for the first year of the sponsorship. It also includes their clothing, furniture, and any other household goods that they need when they arrive in Canada. So if you are going to sponsor, you have to demonstrate to the government that you have all of the money ready for the sponsorship. So you can do that by putting all of the funds into a trust account at a bank. Or group members in your group can contribute from their personal income when the refugees arrive. Or you can do a combination of those two. You can put some funds in the bank, and you can contribute some from your income when the refugees arrive. This is a table that shows the cost of sponsoring refugees based on their family size. So you see in one column, it shows the 12 months of their income support. And then the next column, the startup costs for when they arrive. And then the final column, it has them added together. So you can see for just sponsoring one person, the total minimum estimated cost would be $16,500. If we go down and look at a family of 4 people, the cost goes up to $28,700. This is the minimum amount that you would have to pay in order to sponsor these refugees. But sometimes it does get more expensive depending on where they're going to live and how much their housing costs and things like that. It is possible to reduce how expensive it is to bring a refugee to Canada through donations. So if you donate something to the refugees, then it will cost less money to sponsor them. So for instance, if you have a place for the refugees to live, it can subtract at least $7,000 from the cost of sponsoring them. Another example would be if you had furniture or clothing to donate to the refugees, then you could subtract different amounts of money from the cost of the sponsorship. So when you're going to sponsor a refugee, if you have donations, then it can help make it more affordable to do the sponsorship. Now we have discussed how much it costs and how much money it is to sponsor a refugee. And now I want to talk about the settlement obligations of the sponsors. So the first settlement obligation would just be to welcome the refugees at the airport when they arrive in Canada. Next would be to help them apply for health cards and other documents that they need here in New Brunswick. To help them find housing before they come to Canada. If they need help with English, to enroll them in English classes. To help connect them with a settlement agency like MCAF, where they can get more help with settlement. And to help them find a doctor, a dentist, and other health services here. So this isn't a complete list, but these are just some of the things that you have to do in order to help the refugees to settle in Canada when they arrive. Now, my program has a website which can help you learn all about sponsoring refugees. So if you want to visit it, it's rstp.ca. And through our website, we have webinars that happen every month where you can learn a lot more details about private sponsorship. And we just have a lot of information that you can read about the cost and about settling refugees in Canada.
Tim, would you please show the previous slide once again, please?
Okay, yep, these are the settlement obligations.
I think yes, thank you.
And as I said, these are just a few of them. There would probably be more when you settle refugees. Is that good?
Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay. And so again, here's our website, rstp.ca, where you can find a lot more information about private sponsorship. And I'm happy to answer any questions that people may have now. I will just put my contact information on the screen so that if anyone wants to reach out to speak with me, I'm happy to help you.
Okay, thank you very much. If anyone has questions, please send us the question and I will try to answer.
Yeah, and as I mentioned, if anyone needs specific help with wanting to sponsor people, feel free to send me an email or call me, and I can help you.
I see one question is on the way.
Okay.
So the question is, does sponsorship have to end after 12 months, even if a newcomer doesn't have a language or a job?
So the sponsorship obligation for the sponsors, it does end after 12 months. However, the refugees could still stay connected with a settlement agency for longer after the 12 months if they still need help with language or finding a job.
Thank you.
So that's one of the reasons that the sponsors connect the newcomers with settlement agencies, so that after the 12 months, they can continue to receive help from the settlement agency.
Thank you. Another question is on the way.
Okay.
Any more question? Hazel? I saw someone was typing a question, but I didn't get it. So let's wait 1 minute more.
Sure. And as I mentioned, if you have more questions about your specific cases, you can always send me a message, and I can also meet with people there at MCAF. Yeah, so that's another way to get your questions answered.
Okay, so I think we don't have any more questions. Thank you very much for this session. Thank you very much,
Sure.
everyone, for attention.
Thank you.
Yeah, if anyone has question, please take a picture of the phone number and email and direct them to Tim. Yeah, thanks you too.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. Hope everyone has a great day and enjoy the sun.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.